It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Where every week we look for inspiration from the great men and women of history and current events, seeking to become the heroes and heroines of our own lives. And you are here with your hosts. I am Andrew Bernstein. You are Robert Begley. How you doing today, Robert?
I am doing great, Andy. Looking forward to celebrating the life of a teenager who was instrumental in Jamestown, Virginia, becoming the first permanent English settlement in North America.
Yes. And we're talking, of course, about the Indian princess Pocahontas, who risked her life. According to the stories we have, it's hard to separate truth from legend when we're going back, to the 17th century in Jamestown, Virginia. But according to many of the stories, we have risked her life to save the life of John Smith, an English colonist. And she certainly seemed like an exceptional young lady, didn't she?
Yeah, she did, Andy. And some of the themes that we can talk about today are this idea of moral character, which we bring up in almost every episode. But what kind does it take for a teenager to challenge her father's command to save the life of someone who was from a completely different culture? That's number one.
Father, he wasn't just her father; he's one of the leading tribal chiefs, wasn't he?
Yes, the tribe of Powhatan. Yes, absolutely. And then completely two different cultures. Is it possible for these two cultures to coexist, possibly by reason and persuasion, or by some kind of force? Pocahontas, I consider her a cultural diplomat. And then if we go back to the history which is still subject of debate, would there have been a better way to treat the natives by the Europeans who came here? So those are a couple of things. And also, one last thing, Andy, you just kind of mentioned, how do we separate fact from fiction or fact from legend? That's a matter of validating. We need proof if we're going to make claims, and here we're going to make some claims from some sources, but just as a means of knowledge, how can we verify certain things? So if we could just set the context right, before even Pocahontas was born, European settlement in North America, particularly here now British, because we know the Spanish had settled in Florida earlier, and then what is Central and South America, and the Portuguese as well in Brazil. But there was a colony called Roanoke, which the British had tried to settle under Sir Walter Raleigh, which is what Raleigh, the city, is named after, and it didn't survive. Basically, the locals, the natives, there was absolutely a conflict there, and it never became. It's a historical settlement, but it was not a permanent settlement. And one of the things one reason I admire Pocahontas is that Jamestown was the first settlement. 1607 is when the English landed in Virginia, and John Smith himself was central figure. He came in chains. I look at him as kind of that self-made man, the rugged individualist type that America was kind of, centuries later based on, because he wasn't from British nobility. He was just he knew how to fight, he knew how to trade, and he knew how to make something. He was like a self-made man.
And we've celebrated many of those on the Hero Show. Benjamin Franklin.
That's right.
Frederick Douglass, Alexander Hamilton, just three come to mind readily.
Thank you, Andy. You're totally right. And it's not unique to the American continent, but John Smith, I think, symbolizes that. And early on, when the English come to Jamestown, they don't know. They want to set up a fort. They have a lot of people who don't know how to plant. They don't know how to become self-sufficient. And John Smith is tasked with going out to possibly trade with the local tribes, and he's captured by Powhatan's tribe, and it's a classic. There's even a painting depicting it where he's basically charged with they're ready to kill him, execute him by clubbing him. His head is on like a fallen tree. And Pocahontas sees this. First of all, she's fascinated. She's just totally fascinated that there's someone who looks completely different, acts in a dignified manner. The way Smith was facing death was very noble. And she rushes, she's like 12, 13 years old at the time. She rushes and covers him up so that she would be the one who would actually be clubbed. And of course, the person who's charged with that stops because he knows that she is the daughter, the beloved daughter, the favorite daughter of Powhatan. And this was the first act where, it's pivotal. Okay, if it is true, and there's John Smith writes of this in his diaries. If it is true, that saved Jamestown. That completely saved them, because later on, she would also, so they captured him and they kept Smith in with the tribes, and he starts to learn some of their customs. And he's also seeking out, where do they keep their supplies? How many are in their force in case it does come to some kind of clash. And after several months, they do let him go back to the English, to the fort that they had set up. But winter comes and they are starving. Sure enough, Pocahontas comes in with food and supplies, corn, things they'd never seen before and eaten. So she saves.
That's similar to the Pilgrims up in Massachusetts. Yes, a few years later.
A few years later, that's right, Andy. And you and I mean, here's something else that's interesting. You and I, growing up in the Northeast, we always hear Plymouth 1620, as the first thing, but no, this is 1607, right. 1608. And it's really important that Plymouth wasn't even. So Smith eventually would go back to England and then come back to right around to Plymouth. Like they sent him on another expedition, but not back to Jamestown. So this is where I consider Pocahontas, like by these two actions, saving the man's life personally, and then feeding the starving colonists there, that just puts her on the map. Heroism 101.
Yeah, she's a heroine without a doubt. And I just want to interject as an aside, the story, about saving John Smith's life. It wouldn't be the first time, and certainly not the last, that a beloved daughter has her dad wrapped around her little pinky, and can get him to do, whatever she wants. So.
Are you speaking personally, Andy? Because I think you got a point there.
Yeah, personally, and about millions of other cases. But anyhow, that's a good thing. And Pocahontas, without a doubt, is a heroine, and and properly celebrated as one, as she has been generally for the last 400 years of American history.
That's right. And even her name. So we talk about her character traits. She was curious. She always investigated things. And the name Pocahontas is playful one is the translation there. And she liked to have fun, and she liked to explore. And that was one reason that she found the colonists to be so incredibly different, and wanted to learn more about them and wanted them to live. Did not think that the two sides would actually have to clash. And in fact, at one point, Andy, she saved the colonists because she knew that the tribe, the Powhatan tribe, was going to have a surprise attack. And they realized that these Englishmen they're not leaving. They're coming here. They're here for good, and they're going to impede on our territory. And sure enough, Pocahontas gives them notice, and then they are ready, willing, and armed, for this counterattack. And it was another instance where she saved the lives of the colonists. So right. Time and time again, she's hoping for there to be a peaceful, and we could even say by using reason and persuasion, that was where her motive was, instead of the brute force that
Right.
would certainly come
Right.
later on.
And wasn't her marriage to John Rolfe
Yeah.
a principal cause of
Yes.
peace between these two warring factions? In fact, they even call it the Pocahontas Peace, don't they?
Right. So now if we fast forward, Andy, John Smith, after this is around 5-6 years later, he's called back to England, and the English have in Virginia, they have the idea to kidnap her, which Smith would totally have opposed. And they kidnap her and they hold her effective, ransom. They Christianize, they baptize her, they give her the name Rebecca, which stands for Mother of Two Peoples. So they're changing her around. I don't know how much of this was absolutely forced on her. I'm not a fan of this kind of activity, but as a bartering chip, it worked, because Powhatan did not attack them while she was held captive. And then, as you said, she meets John Rolfe, who's the leading tobacco producer. And that's another thing. She taught, so even if we look at education, she taught them how to plant and even cultivate like tobacco and corn and all these, all these other products.
Crops indigenous to the North American continent, but didn't grow in England, right? So they were unfamiliar to English.
Which is why they were starving. That's
right.
why the colonists were starving all the time. They didn't know. There was two things. One, they didn't know, and they had several noblemen who that work was like beneath me. I'm not doing that. I'm going to let these peons over there do that kind of work, and John Smith is like, I'm going out and I'm doing this. I'm going to trade. I'm going to do this and that. So he leaves. And then John Rolfe, who had a wife and at least one or maybe two children who had died on a voyage over from England. And he was a very pious man, very religious, productive with cultivating tobacco and making it very profitable. And then, yes, he wants to marry Pocahontas, actually asked for like the king and queen's sanction for that, but as a way also to bring the peoples together. So that was, another stage of her life where, okay, now she's done a lot in the New World, and they decide to bring her to London. Okay, first person ever, of any significance.
Let me jump in for a second.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. Kidnapping obviously is a heinous crime, although in this context, it's mitigated by the fact that if we, they're going to attack us if we have the princess as a captive, they may hold back, and so that worked. I don't know if anybody knows if Christianity was forced on her or not. Again, now that's a terrible thing. But if she chose it voluntarily, then that's her choice. But from the accounts we have, it sounds like she and John Rolfe, genuinely loved each other, which is certainly, love is good.
Yeah,
love is always good.
Yeah. And they had a child, the proverbial 8 to 9 months after the marriage. So
it's how long it takes.
Yeah. And the child survived, and, lived in England, and then also in Virginia later on. And while she's in England, she is, she's literally the talk of the town. She's so different from everyone else. They put white powder on her to make her appear more, more European and less, less of the native tribe.
In accordance with the racial prejudices of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And what's going on there in England, Andy? Shakespeare's in his last couple of years. I think she even attended like a Shakespeare play. So there's like all these
Shakespeare dies in 1616. So I guess this would be right near the end of his life.
Yeah, and I think is it the same year as her? 16.
Yeah, she
17.
dies in 16,
17.
17
yeah. Right. That's right. So it's like right around each other. There's so much going on, and but yeah, so she's brought to the royal court, meets King James and Queen Anne, and is, you know, again, two completely different worlds. She's held as like a nobility in both worlds, and not too many people can make that claim.
Yeah, and she was, from what I've read about her, she was generally treated very well
Yes.
in England, and
Yeah.
she was like visiting royalty. And
Mhm.
sadly, on the journey back to Virginia, she took ill. From what I've read, nobody knows what. There's several guesses, and she
Yeah.
died. And she was maybe 21 years old, maybe perhaps only 20.
Right.
So she was very young, and
Yeah.
very, very sad to die so young. But one
Mhm.
certainly we could say without a doubt, as you've been pointing out all along in her biography, she did a lot of good in that short life of hers.
Yeah. Definitely, there is in Gravesend, right out. It's one of the suburbs on the Thames outside of London. The ship was actually on its way back to Virginia. She was
Right.
ready to come back home with her husband and her son, and yeah, took ill. Very likely, it just didn't have the
immunity for
yeah,
European diseases,
thank you,
right?
Andy. That's right, and the immunity, which of course caused millions of deaths.
Yeah,
On the
smallpox.
that's right, on the North American.
Smallpox is the leading cause of death. In the contact with the Europeans, as opposed to
Yeah,
warfare with Europeans. Plenty were killed in warfare with Europeans and later American, white men, but many more by smallpox and European diseases to which the natives had no immunity. Similar to Europeans being unable to venture into the African continent, in the slave
right.
trade, to stay off the coast and trade with the
Mhm.
powerful tribal chiefs who enslaved weaker members of weaker tribes because they had no immunity to malaria. It was only until the 19th century when quinine became, a treatment for malaria that Europeans were able to venture into the African continent. It's similar for the American Indians. They simply had no immunity to these European diseases, and they raged, just killed thousands and thousands and thousands.
Yeah, yeah, very very sad. Actually, malaria. It reminds me of the Panama Canal,
Yeah,
construction of the
right.
Panama Canal, where they solved that problem there. One of the doctors, can't remember his name, but yeah, when you have these two different, completely different cultures, and where immunity is not yet built up, so that's the likely description of how she died. But immediately her legacy was etched in mind, because the story continues, Andy. Okay, now if we go back to what did she literally, jump and save, like in the Disney movie. There's Disney movies. There's a film called The New World, I think, with Colin Farrell and Christian Bale is Thomas Wolfe, and John Wolfe and John Smith. And they're romanticized versions of the story, but John Smith was the one who actually wrote about it, and it has been passed on for centuries now, and this is where I feel like, okay, whatever we know and whatever we surmise, the story warrants a celebration. Okay, because again, I think of Roanoke and I think of Jamestown. One of them survived as settlements and the other did not. And Pocahontas, I think, was a factor in the one that did survive, namely Jamestown.
Right. And talking about evidence and how we do the best we
Mhm.
can to separate fact from fiction, history from mythology. With this story, John Smith was the only eyewitness to it who
Yeah.
wrote anything or said
Yes.
anything about it, because
Mhm.
we don't have the history of the Indian tribes to verify. We have John Smith's account. Now, whatever his motives may or may not have been, that is important. Eyewitness testimony has to be taken serious.
Yeah.
And he was the only eyewitness to this story. So that's that's an important logical and epistemological point here.
Yeah, exactly. Again, if we go by how we know and what we think are the odds of things happening. So
Yeah,
Last,
it doesn't mean his account is accurate because God knows what his motives were, but it does mean he was the only eyewitness, and that has to be taken
that's
seriously.
right. Yeah, yeah, exactly, Andy. And so the last thing that we promised to discuss was this idea of treatment, because you're right when I brought up the fact that the colonists attacking the native tribes and vice versa. This could this have been done better, and if so, how could it have been done better with such completely different ways of life and ways of being? And we've likely talked about this in prior Hero Show episodes. Property rights. Was it the land of the locals who basically trod on it? And yeah, they cultivated it to the extent that they planted corn and things like that. But that's what are your thoughts on that, Andy?
Well, there's a bunch of different issues here. So let's unpack it because this is important. You know, our good friend Dr. Eric Daniels was PhD in American history. Said to me once, "History is messy." That's a nice quote. History is because people's lives are messy, and the way they live their lives are often messy. So I agree with John Locke, on the basic foundation of property rights. That if you mix your labor, with the raw materials of nature, the resulting product is yours. So regarding land, I think if you're planting, and growing, as some of the Indian tribes did in Virginia and in the Northeast and everything, I think the land is legitimately theirs. I think they can make a legitimate. I'm no expert on this, but I think I will argue that they can make a legitimate claim to that land. In contrast to many of the tribes west of the Mississippi, who were hunters, gatherers, warriors, and
nomads.
Nomads. And the fact that you hunt the buffalo over thousands and thousands and thousands of square acres doesn't mean that those thousands and thousands and thousands of square acres are yours. So I think that's a major point. Sound like these Virginia tribes. How do you say it? Powhatan tribe?
Powhatan. Yeah, something like that.
The Powhatan tribes had a legitimate claim to the land. The deeper point about the culture clash, could it have been done better? Well, I mean, I think in the Aristotelian tradition, and everybody out there, if you haven't read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, I strongly urge you to read that novel, because she shows us that the mind is man's instrument of survival. It's how we learn how to grow food, and how we learn how to cure diseases, and how we learn how to build homes and cities. It's also the way rational. The use of our minds is the way we negotiate differences peacefully, whether they're interpersonal or international. So philosophically, it could be done better. It's human nature is such that it can be done peacefully. If being rational is a choice. Negotiating in good faith, sincerely, is a choice people make. And unfortunately, history and current events show us a certain event going on in Ukraine right now shows us that human beings very often don't have recourse to reason and sincere negotiation. Right. They have recourse to brute force driven by fill in the blank: power, lust, greed, hatred, racial enmities, and so on and so forth. So let me point something out. We talk about the culture clash here, but we could go deeper than that, Robert, because let's start with the Europeans. They fight amongst themselves for centuries. They never mind with the Indians. They'll fight amongst themselves for centuries. Yes, they have an advanced culture. There's no question. They made a lot of advances, and glorified Western culture for the obvious advances it's made in any field you want to name, including moral philosophy, which goes back to Socrates. But studying more, a lot of these guys are probably educated leaders. Studying moral philosophy and then putting its principles into action are related but distinct processes. And the Europeans were often brutal amongst themselves. So I'm not surprised that in some instances they were brutal towards, these tribes that they regarded as savages and racial inferiors, or at least lower than them. Now, the Indians were also endlessly engaged in warfare with each other. It's a myth that that they were basically peaceful until the white man shows up. That's just a complete distortion of history. We know that the Iroquois, we'll talk about the Powhatan tribes are some part of the
Algonquin, yes,
Algonquin nation, right?
Mhm.
And we know that the Iroquois moved up into Algonquin territory, long before the white man shows up, and brutally not only tried, to seize their lands, but practiced genocidal, mania, and trying to wipe out the Algonquin to the last man, woman, and child. One of the factors that saved the Algonquin from extinction by the Iroquois is the arrival of the French, who needed guides and armed the Algonquin with guns. So so both sides are warring amongst each other, and it's not just the English warring against the French or other Europeans. They're warring amongst themselves. The English Revolution is soon to come with the Puritans, and versus the supporters of the Stuart dynasty. And before that, the War of the Roses, by means of which Henry VII comes to power. So warfare, unfortunately, is the steam that runs through all human history, and civil warfare. So the answer, the good news is, philosophically, a couple of points that are paramount. One is colorblind individualism versus racism in any forms, related to that moral character.
Tribalism in this case, Andy. Literal tribalism in this case.
Yeah, right. Colorblind individualism versus racism or tribalism in any form. And key point of that is character matters. Race doesn't matter. Tribe doesn't matter. Ethnicity doesn't matter. Human beings can understand that, can accept it. And then, the use of reason to negotiate rather than brute violence as a means of trying to arbitrate, legitimate disputes that arise amongst human beings. So we can do it better, but history and current events show that so often human beings choose irrational methods, rather than rational methods, and then plunge us into violence of all kinds. Race-driven violence, slavery, conquest, mass murder, mass rape, enslavement of the vanquished. It's just, history is more than messy. It's often brutal, and so
And the antidote to that, Andy, is if we go according to human nature, the thing that distinguishes us from the animals is that reasoning faculty that you mentioned Aristotle earlier. And
reasoning and related to that, reasoning and moral character. That's what matters. Not none of all these other things are real, different tribal differences and everything, racial differences, but they're trivially real. It's just like amongst white people, some have blue eyes, some have brown eyes, some have dark hair, some have blonde hair. It's real, but it's trivial. Similarly, if any racial tribal differences, and the character matters, commitment to reason matters. Everything else is enormously secondary at best.
Yeah, and Andy, just closing thought on this, I always go back to Alexander Hamilton, Federalist #1, where he's conceiving of a new nation, he and the other framers of the U.S. Constitution. And he asked flat out, are societies capable of using reason and persuasion or accident and force? Okay. And Hamilton's making that point very clear. And you and I and many others clearly are on the side of reason and persuasion. And I think human history, human progress depends on those factors.
Yeah, there's a real philosophic question that I think we should at least raise before signing off here on this tribute to Pocahontas, and that is about the possibility of a polyglot, multiracial civilization. Historically, it's been very difficult for human beings to do it. I mean, the Armenian genocide is one example that leaps out at us, where the Turks just decided to annihilate the entire Armenian Christian, the Turkish Muslims decided to annihilate the entire Armenian Christian population, murdered at least 1 million innocent civilians. The Holocaust, another example, where the Aryans, if there's such a thing, some of the German Christians, the Jews were just an outside element on Germanic culture and needed to simply be killed. And you can go on and on with this enslavement of blacks. It's been very difficult for humanity to achieve a biracial, a multiracial society, for the reasons we've discussed. But we have pointed out the panacea for this. Reason rather than race-driven or tribal-driven hatreds, and of course the recognition that moral character matters, not any racial characteristics or tribal characteristics. It is possible. The good news. This is the hero show, so let's leave off with on the good news. It's possible for human beings to do this. Pocahontas did.
Yes.
And evidently John Rolfe did, and John Smith and John Rolfe both recognized her virtues and what a good person she was, regardless of racial differences. And so some people have done this historically, and we need to learn from them. We need to learn from Pocahontas' example here. Race doesn't matter. What matters is character.
Perfect, Andy. I have nothing to add with that. I think we're just ready to do a salute to Pocahontas.
We salute the courage of this young girl.
Yes.
Who accomplished so much in such a brief lifespan. Thank you, Pocahontas, for all of your achievements and for your inspiration here, showing us how much is possible to human beings in this endless struggle to overcome racism and tribalism in different forms. So we will be back next week on the Hero Show to celebrate more great men and women as we search and seek to become the best versions of ourselves. So we'll see you everybody next week on the Hero Show.